Hello guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to do the DIY wallet setup. So what we have first of all is in the pack you will get all the parts for making the wallet, including 2 needles, thread, burnishing tool and a beeswax compound that's designed for helping rejuvenate, seal and finish the leather. The actual parts in most of these are consisting of 2 internal card slots, 1 external card slot, a side slot, the internal panel and of course the external panel. As you can see, yes, it is slightly bent from where it sits in the pack. That's not an issue. As you stitch, it will strengthen up and pull itself back into shape. Now, because I don't want to go using up one of the packs that I've made up, I have got the setup here myself. Obviously, this is still the leather balm. As you can see, it is my own make. It is 4 ingredients, very simple, and all is organic. And I have my thread still on the spool because I don't want to spend time winding it onto a little card spool just to take it off again. So to start off, the first piece you will be doing is attaching the card slots up the centre in the internal slide and onto their bases. And like I say, it is the internal card slots, so it would be those 2 going in like that. This one, when it comes to it, we will only attach it in the centre, because when we stitch the back to the front, it will actually stitch 1 stitch right the way through. So, first things first is threading the needle and knowing how much you need. As a general rule of thumb, I kind of say look to have the thread about 5 to 6 times the size of the length of the area you're doing. So for instance, when it comes to stitching the back on to the front, you've got a gap here, so I would measure all the way around 5 times to 6 times. If I'm being accurate, quite often these days I'm just pulling out thread, knowing around about where I'm going to use. So I will pop the balm up there out the way for the minute. I will grab my snips and I will pop these other bits that I'm not attaching at the moment out the way. Now there is 2 needles. For the first bit I'll use 1 because it's such a short area going back and across, and then I'll use 1 across there. Doing the main all the way around, I'll use both needles, but because I'm going to show you how to do it without a stitching pony, the stitch that I'll be using, I'll show you a way that you can kind of cheat at it, because traditionally when you use the 2 needles you're pulling from both ends of the stitch at the same time. Unless you've got a stitching pony, that's a bit difficult to do, so we'll do it with 1 needle at a time anyway, just to make it a bit easier. So first off, we'll grab a line of stitch for that internal piece. Another thing you will need is a lighter of some sort, because you do want to just burn off the ends of the stitch so that they don't fray when you're using them. Now when you're pulling stitches through leather, if ever you've done sewing before, you know that quite often you can easily pull the stitch back out by just the sheer force of pulling it against the fabric. So put your needle through, or put your stitch through the needle, and then tack the actual stitch with the needle so that it goes through. Pull that through part way, then do it again in the opposite direction, a bit further up. So you get sat on the needle much like that. Pull that through. Now this will allow it to move at the moment. So then come back down, go through the main part of the stitch, and then this end, go back through that again. Now when you pull it through, it'll create a little knot. Just pull that tight down, and that gives you a nice hold, so that will not budge now. So you won't end up with it bunching at the top, because one of the worst things when you're trying to pull through leather is that it's knotted around the bottom of the needle, and you end up pulling so hard that it damages your fingers. I've learned that from experience. So, first one, we'll go with one of these parts, the internal card slots. I like to, every now and then, I will double check all of the holes, because sometimes they look like they're cut through, but they're not. And of course, when you're on the back, you can barely see the marks. These ones you can see just about on the camera because I've just popped them. These ones you can't see at all. And there's still another 4 holes there to go. So there is that. And of course, over time, these will close back up as well, but you can kind of get the idea just by pulling back against them, because now they're nicely opened anyway. Again, this one, I can barely see where I'm starting, so I will pop both of the end holes, because I can use this top piece to guide me beyond that. So we're going to go in through the back of the first hole of the top line. Pull that through, bring it right the way up, and keep a decent piece behind and hold on to it as you pull the first few stitches. Again, match first internal piece, come up, bring it down. Now remember, grab hold of that knit thread and pull that in against the other piece. Then from here you're going to go in to the next hole, pull it part way, and I just stabbed my finger. That's a good start. My thumb, and just work that up through to the next point. Normally I am wearing a thimble because I do a lot of stitching by hand, well, all of my stitching by hand, and you do very quickly end up with your fingers being quite nastily destroyed. So remembering to hold that back thread, pull that right the way through, and that will pull into this quite nicely. Now your first pass through isn't too bad, but because these are slightly slotted, when you come to making the stitch look good, you're coming out of the top and into the bottom. So when you go into the next stitch, you want to be as close to the previous stitch as possible. And as you come out, you're aiming to come out of the top, putting it as far away from the stitch as possible and as close to the next one as possible. So we'll pull that one through. That's starting to get a hold already, so I can now let go of that as long as I'm not pulling too tight. In. And out. Of course, when you pull, watch that this doesn't happen. Now what I've just done there is I've actually pulled my needle through the thread loop. So I've got to pass that back through, otherwise I'll end up with a knot coming up here, which isn't too bad when you do it a tiny bit, but it can cause major problems. And of course, when you're using a longer thread, it can bunch up and knot up as you pull. So when you're doing it with a longer thread, I would advise you use a little trick that I do. So when you've got the thread through the hole and ready, put your finger just between the loop. So as you pull it in, it keeps that loop there, and then you know that there's no bunching up or knotting going on. So let's just quickly throw through the last few holes. Now, as you can see, my last hole puts me in the back, so I'm going to pull that one all the way through to the back. Now, even though this is an internal piece, I still always do my full stitch. So now from here, you're coming back down the line. Now if you remember, the top is what we went along that way, so you always go bottom first, then top. So now when we come through here, this will actually line up with the bottom of the stitch slot. Again, I'm just going to pull the one because I prefer working this way up. So we're going top of the slot. I do use the table occasionally to push. I do have a special tool that I can use, but for the purpose of showing that this can be done at home, I'm not going to use all the extra bits that start working up a cost. So that's back out the bottom there. Now as I pull this one through, you should be able to just about see that all of my threads now are sitting going at an angle, and I want to keep that angle the same. That's why you go in at the top, out at the bottom. The more you keep it like that, the neater it'll all be in the end. So, oh, let go. And I left my phone rested up against the microphone stand. That will make a lovely noise. Let's move that over there out of the way. So a couple more holes. See, the good thing about the returning stitch is you can look exactly where the hole is by where the previous stitch came out on the back. Now, for the extra stability, I'm going to pull that one through there, so my stitch is officially finished along the front, but I don't want to leave this gap, and I don't want to tie off across that gap. So I'm going to pull from here through the back of the starting of the stitch and go back out the same way that the first stitch went. So now when I pull this through, now I'm hitting the microphone, that's a good so now that's a solid stitch, that's not going to go anywhere. Come around the back. If you're confident with your stitch, you can back stitch. Obviously I can't do that with this piece at the moment without using a stitching out. I'm not going to do that at the moment because it's easier to just show anyone that's sort of a beginner level. Your best bet is just do a double knot. 1, 2 with that end piece. Now obviously that does leave quite a bump. When you do your back stitch, you can back stitch at 3 or 4 holes and leave the threads individual and burn the ends off. We are going to do it with the knot, which isn't as tidy, but it still gets the job done. So as you can see, I've left this pretty small, but enough that it's still in the way. Take your lighter or your heat source, burn it down, let it go out, heat it back up again and just roll over it. And that brings that flat. Like I say, it's not as tidy, it leaves a little mark, but that's now a flat piece of thread, stopping that from pulling back out. And again, you do the same with this piece, coming down through. Obviously, you want to make sure that it lines up at these ends, because when you stitch up through here, these don't want to overlap. They need to be one against the other, and then the bottom piece against that to there. And there is a little stitch hole here, I'm not sure if it can be seen on camera or not. That's designed so that you're attaching this solid to here when you stitch through. And of course, anyone that's looking at the pack, you do have 2 extra stitches that go on this. They come in the middle, so when you start, you would actually go through these stitches and then start to stitch into the internal piece, go around, all the way around, and stitch back onto the end of here. It's so that when the wallet folds, it has the extra room. So that end up against that, and then when you turn it, you can pull that into there. And as you fold it in together, you can see that it leaves the extra room there for the fold. And of course, any cards or money that is in the wallet isn't making the wallet bulge out extra or deform in any way. So again, because I've still got a decent amount of stitch, which I can do at this point, I'm just going to repop that hole, repop that hole, pull the front through part way, hold the back, and the same through here, pull it down, grab that back thread and sort of pull that in place. I actually just let that back thread slip, but I can feel that I've left enough that I can continue without having to try and pull the thread back out to allow for room. So we repeat this again. We go through top and bottoms to get that next line. Sometimes the first hole or a few holes are a bit difficult to find because obviously the leather can sit at an angle to them. Once you've got those first few, it should be pretty straightforward to continue the run. I say should because it's not always. This one's giving me a bit of trouble. I'm going to just pop through these eyes so I can see the back a bit better. Now what I'm using here is an owl. This can easily be purchased, or you can use other things that are similar. All it is a spiky tool that's designed for either etching onto leather so you can see where you're cutting, or it also comes in very handy for just popping out those holes a bit bigger than a needle would. So now I have my needle, because I've let go of everything, make sure that the loop is all free and I'm not tangling myself up. Line that back up, because whilst you're stitching you can actually pull this out enough that you can see between. Obviously, as you get further, you don't want it to be able to do that, but you can still do it back with the first few stitches. So where I've just done that, I can now grab this back piece, just give it a couple of tugs just to pull that back in, and that's gone tight again to the main internal part of the wallet. And of course, the more you handle the leather, the softer it gets, and the more it ages and adapts to what you're doing. So this leather in particular is pull up. It is from a cow. Obviously you can get leather from many different creatures. This one, I really love it because as it ages, you can work in these cracks. Now, just going to take my front pocket for the cards. I'm screwing that right up into a ball. As I pull that out and straighten it back out, you can see it's got a nice patina effect compared to the standard where it starts. That's how this ages. It gives you a slight idea of what you're going to end up with. Obviously, leather over time darkens as well. It is a skin. If it's in the sun a lot, it will tan more. That's where also making sure that if you're working with leather constantly, don't leave it in sunlight whilst you're not using it. I've even gone to the extent that my workshop has 0 windows. Which is kind of handy because it means that I don't have to worry about if I've left something out on the table, that I'll come in the next day and or after a weekend to find that the piece of leather's darkened on one side, or of course with heat leather also goes tough, so you've got to watch out for that as well. So getting back down to the end, pull that last one right the way through, come back onto the back. Now we're going the opposite way again, top to bottom. But I'm going to do that so I can still work bottom of the stitch to top of the stitch. In. Let's come out at the wrong angle. There we go. Of course, inside here, I'm just being a bit of a perfectionist. I'm still making sure that it's in top and bottom. This is purely cosmetic at this point. Now, you're not going to see that stitch when this one's stitched over the top of it, and you're not going to see that one when that's stitched over the top. It's more for me at this point. I know what I like, and personally, I know a lot of leather workers prefer to use this type of stitching method. Myself personally, I use punches. It's not as neat if you don't finish it though. With these, when you go over them, they look tidy without having to be hammered or rolled in any way. When you punch them, quite often I have to use a groove, so I actually groove it into the leather. So as I pull the stitches through, they actually sit lower, because at the moment they are slightly raised, even on this stitch, but they're not as raised as they would be using a punch. So there's that final end. Make sure that's out of the way, pull that through, and we're tying off. Now, as you can see, I've done this the same side on both pieces. Again, this is more personal preference. If I'm going to make it look a little untidy with the burning, then I will make sure that it's shown as that's what it is and there's not an issue. They can clearly see that it's at the same side each time. The sensible thing to have done, which of course now I'm at this point, is you can do it the opposite way around so that those burns are out the way, so that when you open up the wallet they're not right in the centre. But it's easier to do it at this angle just for showing what I'm doing. So there's the two stitches on the back. So next up you've got this front pocket for your cards. Now I can't stitch the bottom or up this side yet, because all of that is done when I attach the main. So from here, all I can attach before I put that main on is this centre line coming up and the top row of this to come in here, which is the sideways slot for any cards, or quite often people put their driving licence separate to everything else. So as you can see, I've still got times 4, 5, 6 thread there just to do this bit. So again, I don't need to change this needle yet. When it comes to doing the full round, then I will use, like I say, both needles, full thread. I will have to do a small amount just to do the top of that, but I didn't measure it up for what I was doing. So where I said about this, to keep it cleaner, I don't want to start my stitch at the top, because I'll come back to the top and then I'll have a blotch up here. So if I start at the bottom, my blotch will be down here and hidden out the way when everything else is on. So I'm going to just knock through that hole on both. You can see as well, these are lined up to go through where they're meant to. There's a hole just on the edge there that's going to hold this down tight, so you're not going to get lifting. So let's go through the back, both. Now there is another stitch just here on the bottom corner. That one you don't want to touch at the moment. You want the first one up. It's slightly off centre to the other stitch. That other stitch is your bottom stitch for putting all of this on. You can, if you want to, join that. If you do, the best way I've found is don't do it at this point. When you stitch through the bottom, get to that bottom stitch, come up one, back through the same hole and continue, so that you're not making an extra pass with this one through the same hole. It's better to do it the opposite way around, so that you're not crossing over the edge stitch, because you don't want to risk weakening any of the stitches as you come through. So continue on, as always, going top to bottom. I might have to pop the holes on this one as well, just so that I can do this a bit quicker. I mean, that's the other thing, popping the holes on this, for me, is more just so I can speed it up. Because otherwise this video will be a lot longer than it needs to be. I could have done this in advance, but then everyone will go, how come his holes are a lot different to mine? And his looks a lot easier. Well, now you know why. It's better to show you guys how to do any of these little tricks, just to speed things up and make it easier for you. because it makes it easier for you. Right, I'm going to pull that from the back first because I pulled against my retaining stitch. There we go, that's better. Obviously, the more that your needle meets inside, even if it's the small threads of the back of the leather, it can really add up to straining your hands a bit as you're doing it. Which is why I would advise, if people are looking for a decent thimble, don't get a metal one, get a silicone, because it's got that extra grip as you're pulling through. That's needed more than the initial pushing into the leather. When it comes to going into the leather, 9 times out of 10, it's pretty easy going. I've just missed the hole. There we go. It's more so when you get to the thread on the back, it just needs that extra bit of pull. So a decent silicone or rubber thimble just gives you that bit of extra grip. Of course, this does mean if you do push with a rubber thimble, you can push the needle through it. If I actually show you the top of this one, it's pretty rounded because I use it a lot. And I can also show you that there is holes in it where needles have gone through. So I've just reached the top of the internal pocket, or the external pocket, and the bottom of the internal. So you don't go down between them. These should be perfectly lined up for the next set without having to run a needle down in the gap. Sometimes if you are doing your own holes when you're making them, you can end up having to drop between pieces of leather. It's not an issue. One thing that I would advise if you do that though is that you make sure that you've popped just a little chunk out of the edge just to help keep it tidy. So in, and again, as you can see, I've gone back to not using the thimble because I do believe that showing you can have an unfair advantage and constantly using it are two very different things. Although I would advise, if you're doing a lot of this, or your hands are not as covered in calluses as mine, that a thimble is definitely a good way to go, just to keep your fingers from being absolutely ripped apart. Mine are constantly ripped apart. I've got dry skin down the sides here all the time from the leather. That's, well, it's not even from the leather, it's from the thread. As I'm pulling through, constantly pulling and ripping skin. Obviously, I can counteract that a lot by, well, I could wear gloves if I really wanted to. I find it gets bulky in the way and causes more issues than helps sometimes. Top. As you can see, it is looping on the corner. When you are stitching, you can counteract a lot of that by not trying to show it to a camera constantly. That's pretty much the easiest thing about it. Or easiest way to explain why mine's looping a lot is because I'm holding it at an angle that I wouldn't always hold it at. It's not far off, so you can easily stitch like this to make it easier for you, but whatever you feel comfortable with, you will develop yourself over time. I know some people that can only stitch with like a pony, as they call it. These stitching ponies are basically just a wooden vise that holds the leather solid. So that would hold this, for instance, like that, so they can stitch from both sides. And it's either bench mounted, or the one that I do have but barely use is one that you actually straddle the mount, so you can pretty much use it anywhere on the go. I am now stitching from the back of this, but I haven't bothered switching that just because I can finish this one off pretty quick now. Obviously, these pieces in particular, they are roughed edged. So what I mean by roughed edge is they are not beveled. Beveling is something you could do if you wanted to. If you are going to, I would advise that you do it beforehand and know what parts you need to bevel. For instance, if you was going to bevel these pockets, I have just tied my finger up. If you was going to bevel these pockets, then this edge you would bevel, this edge you would bevel, inside and out, just so that it makes it a bit easier. And then when you're finished, you would bevel the whole of this in one go, right the way around the edge, up. You might want to do to there beforehand, you can do it before or after, but basically anywhere that is going to be exposed you would bevel. They do range in price. I mean, these are mid-range, they are pretty good to go for. You can get a cheapy multi-use tool like this on Amazon. They allow for this little grommet to be taken out. You can also get, it also comes with a small chisel, so if you're doing the lines down the edge you can gouge that, and this hole that's through here and this piece that you tighten in that direction holds an edger, so as you pull, your gouge is actually holding onto the side, so it keeps it an even distance away. Right, we are at that point, so let's go through the back. Back up through. And just tie off. Like so. Snip the end. I might just about have enough there to put this top on, actually. I do need to refill this at some point. So, now we've got the card slots are attached. obviously they're still loose on this one side. That's not an issue at the moment. This top piece is just from there to there. Again, we do have the main stitch leading up here, which is at a different angle to the stitch that's leading this way. So again, we would start through the second hole, not the one right at the edge. And I don't know if I've mentioned it, this type of stitch is what they call a saddle stitch. It is the cheap version because I am doubling back over myself instead of doing the proper saddle stitch, which is a lot easier to do with the pony because you've got that room to pull both pieces and you're not having to hold what you're doing. So I'm going to take a gamble, we'll go for it, see if it works out. No, it won't. So again, because of the way I've tied this off, I've left a nice loop there so I can cut that off at point. And I can actually pull that piece back out and then grab there, pulling off a tiny bit and keeping that in my thread box in case I want anything that's a smaller job that only requires a tiny bit. I can just whack it through and have done. Also, all of my needles are magnetised now because I actually have a magnetic tool rack at the back, which sometimes comes in handy, sometimes it's a pain. So again, 2, 4 and a bit easily. So it's knocking on. If I properly put it out, it's most likely around about 5 at the moment. It's just 2, 3, 4, 5 and a bit. But as long as you've got enough that it does what it needs to do. So again, you're attaching at the needle, thread it, go through the thread once, back through from the other side, so you've got the double loop, pull it through, set your length, back through the thread, and then through the end. If you do it the other way, it will still allow movement and allow it to pull tight against the needle. So you do it that way, so that it won't. So again, this time I'm going to start in the corner because this will be sandwiched between the front and the back, meaning that the puddle of, of thread will be more out the way instead of prominent right in the centre top of the wallet. So pull, keep the tail, and through the next onward. Obviously, the more you do this, the quicker you'll get with as well. Each wallet I make, I do get faster. I do know some people that say that they take a lot longer than I do with wallets. But, of course, that's not just down to the actual person, it's also down to the design. So if I was putting in a coin pouch, for instance, that adds a lot of time to a wallet design and build, and also it depends on how quick you are with cutting out. These are die cut, so I do have a heavy duty 2-ton press that's behind me that is just used to cut these out. If I was going to hand design a wallet for someone, I would use a general rule of the wallet building, and then I would hand cut the design out, which of course takes longer because I find the easiest way to make that is with a very tiny sharp scalpel. And I use those because of how much more lenient they are. So as you come around like the corners and that, it keeps them a bit tidier. If you're using a straight blade, you can cut a decent angle, but I find that sometimes it does slow you down. But it always depends on the finish that you want, really. I know a lot of people online post their different ways to cut a corner on, say, like this little corner here on the wallet, and it goes from everything from using circles to actually slicing piece by piece and curving it as you go. I find they all pretty much work just as well as one another. But, again, it really comes down to each individual preference. I mean, I have actually got the Crocodile corner chomper. This is designed for doing card. So it does a 1/4 inch and a half inch corner. You open it up, put a square piece into. If I've got a nice square piece there, you pop that in. Of course, because it's designed for card, it is a little bit harder, but it does cut. If you've got something that's a bit narrower, it can be an issue. So that's the 1/2 inch, and that's the 1/4 inch. But it's a really handy tool. Came across it by chance. Thought I'll give it a go, just to see if it can even cope to get through the leather, and it did. So it was a win. I am moving around my chair a lot here. There we go. Now, what I've just done there, can't see the hole. At this point, I'm not going to go punching them all through. So sometimes it is easier to just pop it from the opposite side. Don't continue your stitch until you've pulled the needle back out and gone back to the correct side. I have done that before, and every time that you do that, I can guarantee you're never going to notice it until you've got at least 3 stitches more, so you have to unstitch it. Of course, when you've attached the needle in such a way, you've got 2 options. You cut the needle off and pull the thread back through, or you try and backstitch without stitching through your own thread and causing more of an issue. So we are almost across the top here. Also, if you do find it hard pulling through more than one thread at a time, then just pull them on. It does take longer doing it, pulling each hole individually, but you can use your time as you wish, you know. Sometimes it is just easier to do one and through and one, because you're not pulling the resistance of the previous stitch. And I certainly wouldn't advise, when you're doing thicker bits of leather, trying to pull through more than two at the same time. I have done it with a belt, where I'm doing a double layer of veg tan, and it does work, but you do find after a while that the amount of extra effort, you could have just pulled 2 stitches at a time, or probably even 1 at a time. When you get down to the smaller end of the thread anyway, pulling 1 stitch is really not that big a thing, because you find that you are just that much closer that by the time you pull, if you're giving a proper pull, then you're pretty much pulling it tight anyway. So there's no point just leaving a tiny bit like that when you can just finish it and go on to the next one without having to worry about where the tail is. Now, I'm not going to hit it, I don't think. I might. If this bit stays in the end, when I get to the end stitch, it's not an issue, because you can just pull that out when you get to the end. Obviously, if it's going through about 5 or 6 holes, you might want to pre-pull it, because the more holes it goes through, the harder it is to pull back out. Yeah, there we go. It's just hit it. So I would have that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes. So just be aware that the tail's in there. Drop the needle between them and just give it a bit of a pull, and it should normally show you which side it is, so you can just pull against it. You'll know which side it is because it actually gives a bit of slack. So now I've got the end showing properly, I can sort of guess, give it a pull, and you can see that it comes away. In fact, at this stage, I could even now go pull that through and just nick that end off, which obviously frees me up, so I'm not having to pull it each time, because now we're making it all the way. So through, and it's met itself again already. So what I'm going to do here is, let's pop the needle off, because it is at the end of where I needed the needle. So this is the one that is through. Camera. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of a pull just to finish it and get it back out. So again, tie it off or you can backstitch. When you're using 2 needles and backstitching, we'd come back to about here, leave them both on this side, and burn them down between to the hole. Because it melts, it pretty much creates a seal to the other thread that's there, but also be careful that you're not burning the other thread that is there. So that knot has actually just come undone, but because it's just a nice little molten ball of thread, you can just finish that up there. And then we're on to the final stitch. So when you're looking at your back piece, there's one part that has no stitching. The top has a full stitch all the way across. That's your bottom. You need to remember, put it the right way up. As it is, this is going to be your start point. So again, we need the thread. So we're looking at about 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I've said 5 times and I've counted 4 because I'm going by my arm reach. So here's where we're going to double up the needles. So there's 1 needle being threaded. Thread them the same still. So in, create the 2 loops, pull it through, and then through the thread, through the end, pull it tight, make sure you burn that end. Sometimes it catches, but it's better to burn that end than have it fray, because if it frays, you can do that very quickly without you realising, and next thing you know, your strong knot has pulled away. Although I'm losing my needles. Right, so good thing to do at this point is the box that this came in. Just stab the needle into the box so that it's held out the way. Because I'm still going to work it with 1 needle at a time, because this is where we truly cheat the saddle stitch. Because if you was working with 2 needles, you would switch needle every single hole. Which isn't a majorly bad thing. If you've got the space to do it, then I would advise doing it, because it does make it a little bit tidier. Obviously, if you've got a stitching pony, or some way of similarly doing a stitching pony setup, then you can work both needles. So when you're doing it with a stitching pony, you would actually put 1 needle through, pull it through a little bit, push the other needle through the same hole, and then pull. When we're doing it this way, I'm going to go that way around. So, in a hole, the first bit you do want to really put both needles through, so they go through next to each other. Make sure that the thread is off to one side so you're not pulling through it. Pull both needles out, and pull the thread whilst keeping hold of both needles with one thumb. Right, we just looped, so again, use your other thumb just to pull that out. That means that these two threads now are around about the same sort of length. So now I separate the thread by pulling the one that's closest to the end, taking that and dropping it down. The one that's already in one stitch, I'm going to pop up there and just pull the extra thread out of the way. So I'm going to be working with the one that's furthest away first. So of course the first thing it's going to do is go in through the next hole and up. I'm going to pull that all the way through. Now I'm not going to pull too tight because I can still pull against the other thread. That starts my stitch. Now I will always say double check this in case I've made a mistake with counting the holes, because there are some wallets that are slightly different. This one looks like it is going to run with the same point. So I'm going to double check. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. Compared to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. So this one, only that one hole is separate, which means on the other side that will be the same. That one hole will be separate. So this thread that I've just pulled up is now set to go through the back of this one, possibly. There we go. Pull it up. Again, I'm going to pull it all the way through. That now starts the hold of the wallet. So this is still in my way at the moment, so I'm going to pull that across and up into there. Mustn't forget to take that back out before I stitch down that side. But once I start stitching over the top, I can then move that thread over this side out the way. Or I can do this in a slightly different way, which I'm probably going to do it that way anyway, is that I will stitch down this edge and up this edge, and then switch needles down this edge, up this edge. So pull that off to one side. Pull that through. Here's where it is a lot more advisable to have a thimble, because it does get a lot tougher to pull through here. Now this bit, as you can see, I did mention about stitching up to this one. You can't do that from here, but when I bring the other thread through, I can actually take the other thread in and underneath and just catch that if I wanted to, or I could pop it down and push through and then push back up through this one, which I will do when it comes to it. I will show you how exactly I mean. Again, I'm going to use the table push down to push the back of that needle, bring that up. In fact, whilst I'm here, so that I don't forget that I've made a little bit of a promise to say that I'll show you what I mean by that, I will do it right now. So we come up in there, bring that up, pull it right the way through. Just pull that thread out the way a minute. Now I'm going to go in through the top one and push at an angle so that it comes out between the two layers. Pull that right the way through. Put the needle back in between the two layers. Push it back out the previous hole that's above. And you pull that through. That now has the smallest stitch, but it just finishes it off at that edge. Let me pop that needle back up there and pull this thread back out of the way so I can continue on with the first line. As much as you can, keep hold of the needle. So when I was pulling everything back down then, I kept hold of the needle and pulled the thread through so that I made sure there was no knots. It's not the end of the world if you get a knot in there. Some you can manage to untie, some you can't. The ones that you can't, you can continue to stitch, but when you're pulling through 3 layers of leather, you will probably need a pair of pliers to pull it through, or something similar that adds to a grip and pulling power. So you just continue this stitch on. So now I am pulling this one at a time. I could do it 2 at a time. It does allow for it with the room, but it's just easier to do 1 at a time for the moment. Every single thread that you pull through can be different. Some of them, especially if you're using punches, if it's punched thoroughly, then you can near enough drop the needle through. Whereas the actual stitching slots are a lot tighter. Which, of course, saying there that one's looser than the other and one's tighter also can tell you that there are pros and cons with both. Like, the actual stitch is not going to be loose on one that's done with a punch, as long as you pull it tight. But you can very easily, as you're stitching with a punched one, you can pull the leather back too much sometimes, and sometimes you can stitch in a section that is loose. If you've gone through about 5 or 6 stitches and you haven't noticed that you've left this bit back here loose, then that will pretty much stay there. Obviously, if you do spot that and you're at the end, then you can fix it, as long as you spot it before you finish tying off and burning the ends. If you need to fix it, the best way would be, well, the needles aren't that strong when you're trying to pull threads up, so I would advise using something like an owl again. So that's got a bit more strength, but even that, if I turn that, you can see that it's no longer quite straight. Handy thing if you are at home, you can sometimes get an old fork and just stick the prong underneath. Just one prong and just go up, up, up. And it's just that tiny bit is all it needs just to pull that along and tension it just a bit more. As you go along this, do bear in mind, I've actually gone for a double run, you can see there is a lot more tension there, and you can actually hear it in the thread. If you're doing that at this stage, make sure you're pulling straight. If you pull at an angle, you can actually start to burn and cut into the leather. And of course, if you're doing that at an angle that's not under the stitch, it will become visible if you're pulling lines up the wallet. But yes, as I was saying, as you come along here, do remember you're only attaching the bottom and the side to this internal piece. You want to make sure that this bit stays open. That's why we've already stitched that, so you're not mistakenly trying to stitch it in up here. Otherwise you'll end up with a wallet that has a side pocket and a very limited cash slot. Although it could work, but it will, obviously, because this is two different sizes, it would pull that and make it bulge, much like that in the middle. Also, what I'm doing here is I'm actually right on the edge of the table, so that as I pull through, I put my thumb between the, well, if I'm doing it so that, let's make sure there's no loops, I put my thumb around like that and separate it out, so all three threads are separate, and I can pull down to my side, so I'm not overstretching, I'm basically just pulling down to my hip, and down to my waist. So each one, it's a decent amount of movement. Push, stitch. At the moment I am being a little bit dangerous because I'm not looping my thumb through the bottom. I do find that when you start, it's not too bad. As you get further, because you're constantly trying to keep hold of the needle, it does slowly twist and twist and twist. And by the time you get to the end, the thread that you're pulling through is trying to rope itself together, and that's when it ends up trying to tie itself off. Although when you are throwing the thread down, it doesn't mean that you are 100% safe, because as I throw that first bit down, it can sometimes loop and get caught inside of this. As it pulls up, it ties itself off as well. If that happens, don't fret. Slow yourself down, because 9 times out of 10, all it's done is basically taken 2 loops and done that. So all you have to do is figure out obviously which one to pull. In this case, it's this one, and it just frees it again. 9 times out of 10, as I keep saying, if that happens, the first you'll know about it is when it stalls you. So that's pretty much where, when you get to pulling it through, all of a sudden it'll go tight and the loop will be there and it will have tightened up. You can use the tip of the needle just to work that apart. If you just work at the hole, the knot, you can sort of make it a little bit looser, and then you can just slowly pull it apart. Don't try and rush it. If you try and rush it, you will more than likely make it tighter and end up having to cut your thread. Now, of course, if you have to cut your thread partway through, it means that you're going to end up with a burn mark in the middle, most likely. If that happens, your best bet is to pull it back through inside, tie a small knot in it, and burn it. Then, no, sorry, let me change that. Pull it back through, tie a new thread to it into a small knot, burn them together, and then continue on as if you're doing it as one stitch. Obviously, you need to make sure that first bit is tight, though. So you can continue a stitch by burning the two together. Here, that wouldn't be an issue. If it was on a point like this, where it can easily get pulled, it is an issue. In that case, your best bet is probably better to just back it up, pull it back a certain distance, and continue from there onwards. You don't want it anywhere where there's a tension, so like the top of pockets. Anywhere that's due to be open is easier to pull against. Whereas here, there's no pressure on that. If that happened anywhere in here, except for the centre, it's not an issue. Pull that through. So the other thing with popping my thumb there is when I'm pulling, I'm not pulling like that. I'm pulling up over my thumb. So there's lower risk of cutting a hole in the leather. So of course, when I'm pulling at this angle, this bit's not too bad because I'm pulling directly down anyway. But when I'm pulling at this angle, I can burn it enough with the length of thread that we've got to actually cut through the top layer of leather, causing the need to either bridge or, in some cases, take that whole piece and start again, which is easier said than done in some cases. You know, this bit is already stitched in quite a bit. If I had to take this front panel off, I would basically have to cut out all of this thread down here and this piece that I've done across here, which it's doable, but it is quite a setback. So try to avoid where possible. Now, when you get to the corner, obviously our previous zigzags were going that way. Our next ones go that way. So, stick to the same rule. I come at the top, in the bottom. So here, I'm going to aim to come out of the top of that piece from underneath. This is a lot more fiddly because I've got less room to put my thumb. Pull that up, and I'll show you on the back comes in at almost direct diagonal on that corner. Continue on. Now, as I've pulled that tight, it's left it nice and neat on that edge. So you'll just basically continue this all the way around, go across the top. This top layer, by this point, will fly across there because it's just a single layer of leather. It's just to make that edge a bit more robust. And then obviously as you come down this side, you have to make sure that you line this up. So this side, you come up and you've got 2 stitches on the end. So one goes through the last piece of the internal piece. The second one is just on that top corner. It's only the outer leather. So when you come down this side, that's going to match. Again, always double check, line it up. And yeah, so we've got one external and one that hits right on that corner. Of course, this has to go through 3 layers at that point, so it does make it a little bit more difficult. As you get to stitching this edge, you can see that's already doing that. So as you come down here, you'll actually have to work against the wallet a little bit to push that out to keep it so that you've got that loop. So when you fold it in, it closes up nicely. I'm thinking that I'm not going to overly bore you by making you watch the last of this bit. It is simple from here. Just follow that edge all the way around both pieces. Obviously, if you've got your stitch and pony, this will be a lot easier. Don't try and stitch all the way around that one and then come back to this one. At a maximum, stitch the top and then catch up, because once you start pulling that out, it can become a problem if you've only got one stitch coming around. So make sure you do switch a little bit, or obviously if you've got the time and the patience, you can do it each thread one at a time. Obviously each person is different. You do what suits you best. And yeah, have fun. Thank you for watching, guys.